Ever thought about keeping ants as pets? No, seriously. Even if you're not an insect enthusiast, what you're about to hear on this episode could change your mind about these tiny six-legged masterminds. From surprising social behaviors to eco-friendly practices, the fascinating world of ants might just offer you a new perspective on these busy little buggers. Stay tuned. You're listening to Starlight Pet Talk, a podcast for pet parents who want the best pet care advice from cat experts, dog trainers, veterinarians, and other top pet professionals who will help you live your very best life with your pets. Welcome to Starlight Pet Talk. I'm your host, Amy Castro, and today I am thrilled to welcome Zachary Liu, a myrmecologist from McGill University, who is dedicated to making science fun and accessible to everyone. He's also the founder of Canada Ant Colony, a professional ant farming company with the philosophy that ant keeping is for everyone. Together, we're going to explore the fascinating world of ants, which I never thought I would even say those words together, fascinating and ants, but I am very intrigued now from doing my research. So from their complex behaviors to why ant keeping has become one of the fastest growing hobbies around. So Zach, thank you for being here and for reaching out to be on the show, because I probably never would have done it the other way around.
No worries. I think ant keeping just as a whole it's something that you wouldn't think is so interesting until you actually look into it, right? So yeah,
exactly. And, so I noticed I was looking on your website, and I'm assuming that cute little boy that has the butterfly in his hand is you.
That's me.
Okay. So obviously you've been I wouldn't even say it's a bug guy, right? Because that would be the wrong term. But how did you get involved in ants, butterflies, things like that?
Yeah. So it's actually an interesting story, and it depends how far back you want to go. But my mom was from like a very rural part of southern China. Like this is somewhere where like every single time I go back, there's like little endangered species I'll notice. Like, oh, I've seen this in a book somewhere. I didn't know they were like, and they're just going to be everywhere.
Oh, wow.
So when she was growing up, she was really afraid of bugs. And for her, that was like really bad because they were everywhere. So when I was born, one of the things she wanted to do was to make sure it was, okay, I don't want my son to be afraid of bugs. And then so at night, like, between bedtime stories, she'd pull out like an encyclopedia of all the animals. She'd flip through it, read it to me. And the idea is that, so I've been very acquainted with, I'm going to say like almost all things nature ever since I was like basically a couple months old. And the thing is that became a thing where like I'd walk home with like frogs in my pockets at like 3 years old. And so I've worked with almost all of the small animals. I've worked with most reptiles, like amphibians. I've got a couple lizards back in my room, and I've worked with a lot of butterflies. I think in middle school, sometimes if you like walked into the living room, there'd be like 600 butterflies flapping around.
Oh, wow.
And it was just something I really enjoyed. Ants is something that I started later on. And the reason it stuck was just because I think that ants, in terms of their behavior, are so much more interesting. And I think it's honestly a little bit like us, right? Like people, they're very social. They have very complex behaviors. And the way I started Canada Ant Colony, so the business specifically was really just, well, there were costs in terms of like equipment or food that I needed to pay for in order to have my own hobby running. And then so initially it would just be, okay, well, I'll catch more of this species. Or I'll breed more of this species, and I know this person wants them. We'll trade for something that I want. And then that slowly grew. And over time, it snowballed into something where it's like, okay, well, we're dealing with like 700 colonies. We're dealing with 5,000 colonies. Maybe it's better to use cash in them. That's kind of how this business started.
That's great, though. I mean, I think there's nothing better than finding a business that is rooted in a passion, but obviously passion alone is not enough to make a business. So, you've definitely got to be smart about it and evolve. So when did you actually start the company? Like, how did you make that transition from scientist and studying to, I think I want to, turn this into a business?
So this actually started the other way around, where I was in the business first, and then I slowly moved into academia, or rather, like whatever contributions I do have. So the thing is that generally speaking, well, at least a couple of years ago, if you wanted ants, it would be relatively difficult to just like find someone who had a lot of them on hand. And that includes for like scientific labs. So for example, I'd have customers who were like research teams who were looking to say like study the effects of like certain like chemicals on ants in terms of like pesticides. I'd have other groups that were looking to say like, oh, we've heard about this species found in this area, but we don't have any like actual confirmation. Would you have any information on this? And then so slowly it's more so that it got looped into the scientific community rather than the other way around. And one thing actually I've found really interesting is that more and more, a lot of scientists that study ants, so like myrmecologists who started as myrmecologists, are consulting hobbyists, so ant keepers, for information about ants, because generally we specialize in like different aspects of the field. They'll typically know a bit less on the actual husbandry and making sure that ants are thriving, and some of the stuff that happens like outdoors, where a lot of times when they're like cooped up in a lab, they're not able to observe a lot of the wild behaviors. And then on the flip side, like most ant keepers are not going to know like the molecular stuff. They're not going to know the ins and outs of like which hormones or developmental organs signal what processes in the ant. So there's been a slow communication, and I'm personally someone that started on the ant keeping side, and then increasingly I'm having more experience with the academia side.
Oh, okay. So when I think about ants, I think about the old school, what was his name? Uncle Milton, Uncle Milty, whatever it was, the ant farm that it almost looked like
it's like a sandwich, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, okay, it was kind of up there with sea monkeys, which I had ordered many, many times as a kid and never quite got them to do anything. So it was just kind of an odd novelty thing. But in this day and age, what kind of people are you seeing keeping ants, and why? Like, what's the fascination, do you think?
Well, I think of a pretty big population. A lot of the ant keepers are still kids and young adults. And I think that's just because those are the people that have a lot more time. Those are the people that remember more clearly, like, okay, being little, like being outside watching all the ants like carry this stuff. And I think that was the reason that it was so popular when Uncle Milton released that little ant farm, I think in like the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Right now we're also seeing a lot of people in like their mid-20s to like mid-30s as our biggest demographic. But we're seeing people from all across the spectrum in terms of age. I would say it's a little bit male heavy, but not significantly so. It's like a 60-40 split. But I think generally speaking, ant keeping is a very diverse hobby in terms of, I think a very large portion of people have looked at ants at some point in their childhood and been like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what they're doing. And I think that's a lot of the draw of what brings people into the hobby into the first place.
So as far as actually keeping the ants, and I did look on your website at the variety of different habitats. I guess I was anticipating like that there would be these enormous habitats, but they don't necessarily need to be in something really large, but there seem to be different styles maybe for different types of ants, or how does that work? Like what would somebody anticipate if they were like, okay, I'm thinking about doing this. What kind of equipment or things would I need?
Yeah, so generally ant keeping all the setups kind of come in two parts. The first part is the formicarium, or the nest. That's where that's where the babies are being born. That's where most of the ants live in. It's basically what's happening underground normally. There's another section that's called the outworld. It's where the ants are foraging for food. It's where they're putting their garbage. That's for them what's normally like outside, right? And in terms of like there's small variations in terms of the material, in terms of like the aesthetics of what one of these nests look like, but generally speaking they all fit into that framework, and typically the vast majority of species can be kept in the vast majority of nests. I do appreciate your comment on the size of a lot of these nests. So one of the reasons ant keeping I think is so easy is because ants, they're smart, and they live in such a wide variety of habitats and environments. And so one of the things with ant keeping, for example, is that the ants, they'll change or they'll control their growth rates based on the environment they have. And so, for example, you'll have some people that just keep a colony in the size of like a setup, maybe like the size of their palm.
Oh, wow.
And the idea is that if you wanted to and you gave them a lot of extra food and you heated them a lot, you could grow them to something. And I've known people that have done this, where they'll have parts of a nest in their basement, and then they'll have tubes going through their stairs into like their living room, and there'll be another part of a nest there. They'll have all the way into the bedroom, and like you can have setups that span like 3 or 4 stories, but really it's something where, because the ants, they'll generally adapt to what they're given. It's something that can also be something just on the corner of your desk. And there's species that naturally, for example, will live in the size of will live in a literally an acorn. And there's species that will take tens of meters of worth of soil out of the ground. So there's a lot of diversity within the actual size, but generally speaking, they can most of the ants can live with most of the nests.
So I would assume, I know that one of the things that, I don't know if this is something you actually said or something that I had read, that it was, kind of similar to keeping fish. And I will be the first to admit, I've had terrible luck keeping fish. But so hopefully ants maybe are a little bit easier, but I'm always concerned when I'm keeping something in some type of container. Is it the appropriate environment for that pet? It's like, yes, it can survive, but is it thriving? Is it, for lack of a better term, enjoying its life or living its life as it should be intended? But so I would assume that knowledge and research comes into play in picking the right ants, and like you said, the way that you maintain the environment so that they're matched appropriately to their habitat that you're planning on keeping them in. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a big part of it. This is something that I think is unique to ants, for example, but a lot of people that are used to other pets, the main issue is, for example, that their setup is too small.
Right.
Like overcrowding is a very big issue with a lot of pets. For ants, it's usually the other way around. So normally in the wild, because ants, they're digging slowly into like a wood or soil or a substrate, normally their nests are pretty compact. And for example, the way they protect each other from diseases, it comes from grooming, comes from being very close to each other. And one of the behaviors they do is that they'll create a garbage pile, they'll create a graveyard, and they'll put like garbage or like the dead bodies there respectively. And then with very big habitats, if it's too big, the ants struggle to distinguish between what's underground and what's outside, and then they'll start like piling garbage inside, for example. So generally for ants, the most important things are just that you don't want to give them something that's more than like 3 or 4 times the number of chambers or the amount of space they can cover. Like the biggest important things are giving them heat. And then in terms of, for example, like actual enrichment, normally what I would suggest is having a large foraging area or a large outworld, because ants, they're used to a very, very small nest underground, but they're theoretically used to infinite outdoor space. And so I would assume that any of those behaviors that you'd be looking for more so in the wild, that would help if you would have larger and maybe even more like decorated or complex foraging areas for them just to explore around.
Well, and I would think that would be more interesting, if you had just something that was very, very small and very limited, because I'm assuming they're self-contained. We're not taking the ants out, or are we? Taking the ants out of the environment and playing with them, or letting
Generally,
them crawl.
they're self-contained.
Okay. So if they're self-contained in something that's not all that exciting for them or for us, then how is that good for anybody? So having, creating an environment where you can see what they would naturally be doing, like you said, foraging and things like that.
Generally, one of the issues with this is that there's just not that much information in terms of like enrichment for insects. Like we definitely know that some of them exhibit like quote unquote play behavior. And then there have been a couple ant keepers that have tried, for example, like putting little tinfoil balls for like harvester ants, and they'll notice them, they'll be fiddling with them all the time. And there's definitely, I would say, an importance in terms of like the habitat complexity, where if it's just like flat terrain, that's probably not ideal for them. But I would say this is somewhere where it's definitely a very like evolving part of the hobby, a very evolving part of just the information that we do know about how to give them the best life that we can. But I would assume for sure that having a little bit more complexity there is better.
Yeah.
And generally that is going to correlate with how interesting the setup is for you to watch as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you had mentioned, I never even thought about an ant graveyard and an ant garbage dump. It sounds to me, and I know that you had mentioned this, the idea of the social structures that they have and the way that they live their lives. One of the things that you mentioned was some of the behaviors like doing surgery. And it's, tell us a little bit about some of the interesting things that, let's say if I was investigating it for myself, or if I was a parent and I was like, what's my kid going to learn by having some ants in a thing on his desk or her desk? What would we be seeing on a daily basis?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things that is most obvious, and a lot of times when I show this to people, they'll be like, wait, sorry, you're telling me the ants did this by themselves? Is that the ants, what they do is that they'll organize the entire nest and where everything is based on like environmental conditions like humidity, like temperature. So for example, for most ants generally, the eggs need the most water because they have really thin membranes. They dry out very easily. So they'll select the wettest part of the nest. That's where the eggs are. And then as an add-on to that, it's like, well, the queen lays eggs. And then so maybe instead of moving the eggs all around, we'll just move the queen into a chamber near like the egg chamber as well. And then you'll have, for example, a distribution where cocoons or pupae, they're okay with drier areas. They'll be in a dry area. And then so, for example, with different types of foods, like seeds for a lot of harvester ant species, they'll find a dry area of the nest. The idea is that they don't want them to rot or to germinate as basically a granary. And then you'll even have some species, even species in the US and Canada, where they have a strategy where, do you know how malting works? Like you've heard of malt before, like malt liquor. Yeah,
for sure.
So the idea is that you take some seeds, usually barley, and then you let them germinate a little bit, and that starts the process. That makes them a lot softer, and it creates a lot of sugar. So some of the ants have figured out how to do something similar for a lot of the harder seeds that they're digesting. And then so what you'll see is that you'll see ants move larger seeds into a wet area, wait until it starts sprouting, and then they'll go in and empty it out and carve it out.
But they're not brewing their own beer down there.
They're not brewing their own beer. Not yet, not yet. They do make their own bread. They do make their own bread, though.
Really?
Yeah, you'll have some ants where they'll chew that up with like an enzyme, and it breaks down the starches into sugar, and it's basically like it's almost like a cookie dough, basically, but for ants.
That's crazy.
Another really interesting thing, this is always something that people don't believe, but like being able to potty train your ants. Okay, when you live in really high colony densities, normally what becomes a risk is disease, right? So ants have a lot of sophisticated ways to prevent disease. You'll have some species where, for example, they'll go outside, they'll collect some types of tree resin, and they'll spray it with their own venom. And it combines to create an antiseptic, and they'll cover their nests with that. And then so the idea is that, let's say there's a forager from outside. Let's say that on the off chance they've contacted some sort of disease or pathogen, on the way back, just by walking over their nest, they're getting sanitized because it's covered in this antiseptic. Like another example is the graveyards we were talking about earlier. So generally ants, they want to put dead bodies and dead things and garbage as far away from the nest as possible. And they want to make it so that it's somewhere that's dry so it doesn't rot and like fester basically with like some other disease. So one thing you get to see is that you get to watch the ants. Normally they'll pick like a side of the outworld that's far away from the nest, that's dry, and they'll put all the garbage there. And then the fun part is the ants, they communicate with each other using like different chemical cues. And one of those chemical cues is something along the lines of, okay, well, this is garbage. You have to put it in the garbage pile. And so one thing you can do, you can put a little jar in a foraging area, for example, and then you put the ants' garbage inside the jar, and they'll think, okay, I have to put the garbage in the garbage pile, and it just so happens that it's moved into this little jar. I'll keep putting garbage in the jar.
Taking the hint.
Right.
So what constitutes, other than, I would assume, their waste? I mean, what is ant garbage? Like wrappers from, pizza boxes? What are we talking about here that they're putting over there?
Yeah, so a lot of it is going to be poop. So one funny thing, one recent discovery is that there's scientists that have created this whole model that has that helped them figure out how ants choose which room to be like the designated toilet room. A lot of times, so ants generally they'll eat they need some sort of carbohydrates. Normally that's like sugars, like think like maple syrup or honey or nectar, and then they need protein. So and for when you're little, that's normally in the form of other insects. So a lot of what they're throwing away is shells of other insects. So maybe like a piece of a cricket that they couldn't get to, or like the wing of like a fly. So ants, a lot of ants, they'll spin a little cocoon before they emerge. It's kind of like they grow up in a similar way butterflies do through complete metamorphosis, and they'll have a little pile of like cocoon casings, for example, and that'll be part of the waste. Sometimes some ants will use like sand as basically a sponge to pick up liquids. And then so you'll see a pile of like also just like sticky sand, and it's stuff that they used it to move around some sugar, and then they've shrunk all of it and it's sticky, it's gross, they'll throw it away.
So tell me about the surgeries. I have to know. What kind of surgery are they doing on each other down there?
As far as I know, it's nothing too complex, but this was a more recent discovery. But a lot of ant species, what they can do is that they can detect if certain limbs are infected, right? And then so what they'll do is that they'll, based on where in like a leg, for example, they'll figure out whether to do an amputation and then whether or not to apply like antibiotics directly to the wound, whether or not they have to sanitize or, for example, like spray acid onto like the wound as well or the surrounding area. But it was a recent discovery where certain diseases, like one of them is called Pseudomonas. It's something that affects humans as well. So it's like there's like big outbreaks in hospitals all the time. But it seems that it's a disease where when ants are infected alone, the survival rate's something like 8%. 8% of them will survive after 2 weeks. But when they're in a group where like they're actively like, oh, they find an infection, they'll cut off that part of the limb, they'll apply antibiotics to it, the survival rate jumps to something like 80-90%.
We'll be right back.
Our pets aren't in our lives nearly long enough, so isn't it important that we build the best relationship with them that we can? Let us help. Get our exclusive guide, 10 Tips for Building a Lifelong Bond with Your Pet, and start transforming your relationship today. Just go to petparenthotline.com/bond with your pet. That's crazy. That's just amazing.
I thought this was really funny, but I also, for this disease specifically, I looked it up what like the regular survival rate for people was, like in our hospitals. It's somewhere in the 60% range.
Wow.
So it's something that they're apparently doing better than we are.
Apparently they got a better system down than we do. Okay, so let's talk about kind of like I mentioned, I have not had the best of luck keeping fish despite doing tons of research. Maybe I'm making it too complicated in some instances, but something that I had read, and I think it was on your website, talked about that, once you have your setup, and an appropriate setup, that it's not horribly time consuming, because I'm thinking about kids and, as much as a child might be interested in caring for a pet, their time commitment is probably not what we might want it to be as parents sometimes. So what all is involved, let's say whether it's on a daily or weekly, monthly, however often we have to intervene in this environment that we've created once we get it set up?
Yeah, so generally ant keeping, it's a really easy hobby, and the reason is because the ants are doing most of the work for you.
Yeah.
Generally, all you have to do, it takes around 5 minutes a week. Number one, you give them water. That's twice a week. You give them some sugars, and that's usually like a maple syrup or honey. That can be like a drop on like a tinfoil plate. There's also a lot of like automatic feeders available where it becomes you fill it every 2 weeks or so. And then you give them like a piece of an insect. So that normally that can be like a piece of a mealworm from like a pet store or like a cricket, or even like if there's like a fly at your house and you catch it and you throw it in, they'll eat it. One really nice thing about ants, and so I'm someone who has to travel a lot for work and also because like my family lives 5 hours away, but most ants, and this is especially in like the northern hemisphere, it wouldn't apply as much in Texas, but for example, normally in the winter, when it gets cold, the ants, they go into like a hibernative state. It's something called diapause. They basically slow down, the babies stop growing, the adults, they stop going out and foraging, and it's like a very deep sleep, or like at least not as much activity for a couple months. Mm-hmm. And one thing you can do, for example, let's say that you're not able to take care of your ant colony for a while, throw them in the fridge. For them, they'll act as if winter has arrived, so they'll slow down and everything. All you have to give them is water, and then say at a better time of year, let's say, or let's say that you're just going on vacation for a couple of months, or you'll be out of your house for a couple of months.
And you can't find an ant sitter.
Right. You come back, you take them out of the fridge, and they'll resume life as if springtime just came back.
Wow. How long can they stay like that?
Generally speaking, around like 4 or 5 months up to.
Wow.
Generally, the time period we're giving them here is around like 3-4 months. I am here from Canada, and I know that in the States, most of them need a lot less. Most of them need a lot less than that, or would work with a lot less than that. But even in like parts of California we're talking about, could be in the fridge for 3 months pretty easily.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. All right. So I noticed on your website that, and I love the resources on there. There's so much to read. There's so much to educate yourself. And it's nice to kind of have that, number one, from a reliable source, and to have it in one place. And I like that you kind of guided people towards like beginner. This is where a beginner might start. So let's talk a little bit about species, because my experience with ants living in Texas, growing up, yes, the ants were fascinating. I don't know what ants they were. They didn't bite. They didn't sting. They didn't invade your house. They were kind of outside doing their thing, kind of like we called them picnic ants. And that was kind of it. And they were fine. But here, fire ants are the scourge of my existence. As a matter of fact, I've got fire ant bites all over my feet because I was accidentally standing in some. It's just like a constant thing. And I had seen something somewhere that was talking about people keeping fire ants as pets. So I guess what I want to know is, what kind of species are we talking about here? And I also noticed on your website, when I was looking at the actual like ordering ants, that there were specific states like Georgia only. And so how does that work? We just can't like randomly pull some invasive species from somewhere in the world and, oops, it got out, that probably wouldn't be good, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of questions. The first thing is like what ants we're normally selling. So generally on our website, we're selling species that are native to especially Canada, and a lot of them from the States, and species that are like maybe not native, but they're very established. So think about like rock pigeons, for example. They're not native in every single city, but they're going to be there in every single city, and they're going to be species that theoretically you could find outside, and if they get out, it's not going to be a very big deal. That's generally what we're working with in terms of the species on our website, and we take care where species that are particularly like able to become pests, pharaoh ants especially, for example, we generally stay away from. If someone has an experience, we'd rather not give someone an experience where there's a risk of anything bad happening, like in other parts of their life because of their pet.
Right.
So in terms of the question you asked on like restrictions, especially in terms of the hobby. So there's a lot of restrictions on ant keeping, especially in North America. And it's because of the fire ant. It's because I think on some agricultural shipments from Argentina, like decades ago, arrived in the States, and then now there's a bunch of invasive species actually that come from parts of South America. And then so the US government and the Canadian government, they're afraid of this. It's pretty fair in terms of generally the legislation is that in Canada you're not able to get ants from outside the country, or rather it's very difficult. We do, but there's a long approval process. And then in the States, generally you're only able to get species from within your own state, or at least ones that like are native to your own state.
Okay.
So that's what the restrictions where we'll have like state specific like ability to purchase. That's generally where that comes from.
Okay.
I think that a lot of people, and obviously there's a bias here, I think a lot of people in the hobby, more so in Canada than in the States, argue that it's like the measures they take are a little bit extreme. So for example, one of them is that by default, all ants that are from outside the country are like fully banned here in Canada, right? And obviously the fear is that they're going to come out, they're going to become invasive species. Right. And that's a relatively reasonable risk for some species of ants. But there's other species of ants, for example, where like there's ants from like the tropics where they're not going to survive under 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And here in Canada, we're getting negative 50 degrees every winter. And it doesn't matter whether you're using Fahrenheit or Celsius at that point, and the ants are 100% going to die. But it's definitely a changing body of legislation, and generally both governments, I would say, are loosening up a little bit in terms of accommodating for like ant keepers, both as a hobby and as an industry. What's interesting though is that if you compare what ant keeping looks like here in North America to what it looks like in Europe and Asia, it's a completely different landscape. Because generally in both of those areas, they have a lot less experience with invasive species. And then so generally for them, instead of having like everything is default banned, everything is default legal to bring in. And then so in a lot of parts of Europe, for example, you'll find ants in like a third of like all pet stores, and a lot of the big cities will even have like ant specific stores that you can just go into.
Oh, wow.
So I would say it's a phenomenon where it's definitely smaller in North America too.
Yeah.
And because of the fire ant.
Yeah. So obviously as an adult human, if I wanted to pursue this as a hobby or have ants as pets, I can do my homework as to acquisition and habitat and what's allowed, what the process is to get them. But if you were advising parents, so my child came home with a book on ants and now they want ants as pets, what would be a good chronology or progression or steps? Like, first step, I should do this, if just on a high level to go from the idea to acquisition.
That makes sense. So generally what I would advise is, I would say for parents with kids specifically, it would usually be better, especially if it's to like find a reputable dealer. There's several in the States. There's us in Canada. And for example, like Ants Canada, they have something called the Global Ant Nursery, where if you like look up your city, they'll link you to someone who has ants, who's local to you, that's willing to sell them, right? Generally speaking, ant keeping is something that doesn't need a lot to start. They start in little test tubes, like little colonies. And what I would say is that you really don't need anything other than that. What I would say, though, is that for parents with kids especially, if you have the option to, and maybe this means paying a little bit extra to start with a larger colony, that's generally going to be better. And the reason is because larger colonies are going to be a lot more active. In the wild, when they have 3 workers, they're going to be scared. They're not going to go out because then they're risking a third of their workforce. But when they have like 25 to 50, which is, I would say, a more ideal range, they're going to be a lot more engaging to watch. Yeah. And one option is just to have you ever seen ants with wings?
I have, yes.
So those are ant queens and ant males, basically. And they're going out, they're flying, they're mating, and they're picking a new spot to start a colony. One easy way, especially if you're on a budget, is just to look for one of those. It's called a nuptial flight, just to collect a queen. What you do, you take a little test tube, you fill it halfway with water, you block it with cotton, you put the queen inside, you plug it up, and then she'll start she'll raise the first generation of workers herself. Maybe 2 months later, you'll have a small colony with a couple workers, and you just feed them and grow them slowly for there. So this is
so you're just talking about getting something, because I was going to ask you about can I just collect an ant from outside and start my own family? So
the answer is yes, but only if it's a queen.
Okay,
so right, and then
you'd have to know that.
Those are those like big ants with wings normally.
Right.
So it is something you can start for free. It is going to be a little bit less engaging at first, just because.
Right.
The analogy is that I like is that, let's say you want a tree. Let's say you want like a little tree, right? Or you have a couple options. You can buy a tree, you can buy a sapling, you can get a seed. And so in this case, generally, I would advise getting a small to mid-sized colony. That's the equivalent of like a sapling. But if you'd like, and this is going to be a lot more budget friendly, you can look outside, try to find a seed or like a queen in this case, and start it from scratch on your own. And for some people, that's very rewarding too.
Yeah. Yeah. It just depends on are you going for the instant gratification of all the activity, or are you willing to wait it out? And some people they like starting from scratch, and look, I started from just this one thing and it kind of built to this. So yeah, but I would guess that's probably not the best way for kids, because kids, I don't think would have the patience. That's what I mean. Yeah.
If you think your kids are patient, you can go for either, but
yeah, doubtful.
They're pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we first talked, we talked about ants as gifts, and many times on our show, we've talked about giving pets as gifts, and in general, not a great idea, can be a great idea in certain circumstances when all the homework and the forethought and whatever else has gone into that. But what are your thoughts? We're kind of going into the holidays. If somebody's listening to this episode and thinking, oh, that would be a great gift for my kid, what would be your, do's and don'ts, or what would be your advice to them?
Yeah. Well, I think that One thing that I do want to bring up, this is especially for families, I've definitely noticed that there's a difference between, or that there are people who, hey, I want this as a gift for my kid. I think they'd be really interested. And there's people who, hey, I really want this, and I can use my kid as an excuse to get this. So I think there's definitely a split there. And I think say the biggest thing is to make sure that there's someone who is, number one, able to take care of the ants, and number two, willing to take care of the ants. And in the case where you're giving this specifically just for your kid, it's making sure they've taken the time to research. And I would say that especially that they've brought this up or asked to. I think generally if you're unsure whether or not your kid is looking to get into ant keeping, it's generally not the best idea just to spring it on to them.
Yeah. Maybe get a book about ants or something like that.
Right. One alternative, even I think in that case might just be getting some of the supplies in terms of, oh, here's a little ant farm. There's no ants inside. If it's something you're interested in, this is something they can pursue later. It's like getting it would be the equivalent of getting like a little empty fish tank. Or for example, like you mentioned, where like you're getting things like a little book, or like maybe, I know there's a lot of like ant related video games out there, right? Related like board games even. There's a lot of options, but generally I would say that getting the actual pet, unless it's something that's been discussed before, isn't something that's great just like under the Christmas tree, right? Especially unsuspecting.
Yeah, especially if you're not willing to then take on the responsibility for that. Mm-hmm. Because if the kid has no interest in it whatsoever, and they're like, yeah, I don't like that, I don't want that, ew, bugs, then now what are you going to do? It's a living thing. You need to take care of it. So be prepared that you now have an ant farm, mom or dad or whoever.
Right. And that's why I make the distinction where we definitely do get a lot of people where just from the way they talk, it's like, oh, I really want an ant farm, but I think it'd be easier to say that my kid did. One other thing that we do, and this is especially for things like gifts, but we have like we have a voucher system where instead of buying ants, someone can just buy a little card. It'll have a little code on the back, and it'll let you redeem like a free colony of ants somewhere down the line, where it's something that you skip a lot of the issues in terms of, okay, what if they don't want ants? What if like something changes halfway through? What if, for example, like life circumstances, you're not able to take care of these, or even just, and this is more relevant here in the north, but it's really cold in the winter. What if we'd rather start this in spring where shipping is going to be less expensive? And in that case, instead of getting them a little colony, it can just be, hey, here's a little voucher. It's a little code. And if you're interested, once you're ready for a colony, here, we've basically pre-purchased something for you, and you can redeem it anytime you want.
And I'm assuming I could get a voucher for the habitats or for whatever, just a voucher from your website so that people, they could use it for what they need when they're ready to move forward.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And just for point of clarification, just to make sure I'm understanding this. So since you're based in Canada, mm-hmm. Can I know I could obviously order equipment from you. Can I order ants from you, or I could order the equipment and then I would go to a resource to find somebody local to get ants for me in the US?
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, you're not going to be able to get live ants from us. We do have like a sizable network of folks in the States, and that's why there are some ants on our website where it says where it says you're able to receive them. If you're in the States, it's because we've partnered with someone locally in those states to send them out.
Got it.
As I mentioned before, there's also a bunch of resources in terms of if you look on like Craigslist, if you look in like different forums, if you go to like the Global Ant Nursery project I mentioned, they'll connect you with someone local who has ants for sale. And there's a couple like retailers in the States as well that'll have the permits to ship ants around. Okay. But generally, the barrier to entry isn't too high. There might be a little bit of searching that needs to be done still. We're working on like a partnership in the States to make that a lot easier in the future. But yeah, it's something that you wouldn't be able to get from us directly, at least not the ants themselves.
Yeah. But everything, because what I liked is just the variety of and obviously we talked about the appropriateness of the size and the type of habitat, but just it was more than I thought it was going to be. I figured when I went to look at the actual habitat that it would be like, okay, you can get this or this or this, but there was a lot. And I like the little log ones. I thought those were super cool.
They are, no. Because
they're attractive and, have all the little compartments for them to do their thing.
It's like a little art piece, right?
Yeah, exactly. Is there I would assume when you identify ones that would be more for beginners, it's because of ease of care, or does it have to do with their activities? Like, are they that different in what they're doing and how once they're in their habitat, I mean, are they all kind of living their lives as ants, or do different ones have completely different types of activity that they do, or?
Generally, they'll have very different activities, but generally that doesn't affect the care significantly.
Okay.
Yeah. Like two families in houses, let's say one of them has like a pantry, one of them doesn't. They're still going to go outside to the groceries, buy the same things. They're just doing different things inside.
Right.
And you don't have to interfere with that.
Okay. Let's flip it up a little bit. So I've got a habitat full of cats and a habitat full of horses. Mm-hmm. Obviously, horses and cats are doing very different things in their lives. They eat different things, whatever. Are the different types of ants that different as far as like, oh, these are more interesting to watch because they do this, this, and this, or these are more interesting to watch because they're more social, more aggressive,
okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to would a person have two different types of ant colonies because this one is cool because it does this and this one is cool because it does that?
So generally there's two categories of ants. I'm going to categorize them in two portions now. And some of them are generalist ants and the other ones are specialist ants. Generally speaking, generalist ants are going to all have very similar behaviors. They're going to all have very similar diets. They're going to be easier to care for, and that's what we typically recommend for beginners. But there is an option where, let's say they're confident and they like how the hobby is going, where there's a lot of specialty species where their care requirements are going to be very different. They're going to be like the equivalent difference between a horse and like a cat. But generally those aren't what's being suggested to people entering the hobby right out the gates.
Well, like keeping fish, right? The difference between keeping a
goldfish and a shark.
Or a goldfish and a saltwater something or other, where it's a whole different ball,
but for
different needs, different lifestyle, everything else.
Right. But for example, most of the freshwater fish, they're going to be similar enough where like they might do better if you make like XYZ adjustment. But generally, like they're all going to eat like similar foods, or not all of them, but most of them are going to eat similar foods. And anything that doesn't is generally not like going to be given to some like a first-time ant keeper out the gates.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, good.
Generally, 95% of species do great with just like a sugar mix, insects. Even the ones that eat seeds, for example, they do so primarily optionally. So they can take sugar, they can take insects, and if you want to give them seeds, that's certainly an option, but they don't have to have them to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. So your YouTube channel, Down the Anthill, and I was watching some videos and they were very entertaining, but the one with the leafcutter ants I thought was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So I run Down the Anthill. It's just little short form content about like the ecology, about different aspects of ants and ant society that people generally wouldn't be guessing, right? The tagline is the idea is that we're bringing you the stories of ants. We're on YouTube, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok. Generally, we do pretty bad on YouTube, but on Instagram and TikTok, we're relatively more popular. But for example, one of our more recent videos talk about leafcutter ants, and it comes from like a recent, not that recent, but it comes from like a semi-recent study where it turns out that leafcutter ants, and this is collectively, not any individual colony or species, but collectively they have like the equivalent carbon emissions of like a small country. And the reason is just because they're cutting out so many leaves, they're turning them into mushrooms, they're producing a lot of compost or like manure equivalent, where it has like a measurable impact on like the global climate. Leafcutter ants are definitely a group of ants that are a lot more specialized in terms of like what the keeping looks like. They're not a species we generally suggest for beginners. The idea is that instead of going out and hunting for like insects, or instead of going out and looking for sugars, what leafcutter ants do is that they cut pieces of leaves, little plants, and even like insect poop. They'll bring it back in and they form a fungus that is reliant on them. And they basically fertilize the fungus. They even weed it. So they'll use like specific, like ant-specific pesticides to like take out like other types of fungus or bacteria they don't want in their little gardens. And then they basically eat the fungus, the mushroom. It's the only thing they eat. And there's little ones that are native all the way up to like New York. And then the bigger ones, so generally Atta, that's what they're called, are native all the way up to like, I think like southern or even like middle Texas.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating in that video how smart they are to have adapted their environment. The example that you were talking about, how they build their little mounds on the ground so that they can basically release the carbon dioxide so they don't gas themselves. And it's like, that's pretty amazing how they've adapted to survive.
And it's funny because so what they do is that they build the little vents, right? And so air comes in one way and it flushes out all the carbon dioxide and it basically freshens the air on the inside of the nest. And it's interesting because these are structures that humans have. Like for them, it's basically like a slightly more advanced chimney or like an air powered ventilation system. And it's something that we've invented, like humans, maybe in the last couple hundred years, and it's something that they've had for millions of years before we did.
Incredible. It's incredible. Well, Zach, I have to say, when you first reached out, I was like, yeah, I don't want to do anything about ants. I don't like ants. And now I'm just completely fascinated by them. I just thank you so much for reaching out and for caring about ants and caring about educating the world about them and not only their entertainment and quality value as pets, but just their impact on the environment and on the world. I just think it's so important that we, learn about the creatures that are in our world more than we take the time to do on our own, I should say. So Thank you so much for being here on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll definitely put some links, obviously put links to your website and to the nursery that you mentioned. So I'll make sure I get those links in our show notes. And, for everybody that's listening, again, we don't like to give anything as pets to somebody that is an unsuspecting recipient. But for those of you who might be looking for a pet that is self-contained, easy to maintain, do your homework, see if it's a fit for you. But, ants might be the thing. It might be a great alternative to keep you company and keep you entertained. So check it out. And thank you for listening to another episode of Starlight Pet Talk. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to Starlight Pet Talk. Be sure to visit our website at starlightpettalk.com for more resources, and be sure to follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss a show. And hey, if you like this show, text someone right now and say, I've got a podcast recommendation. You need to check this show out, and tell them to listen and let you know what they think. Don't forget to tune in next week and every week for a brand new episode of Starlight Pet Talk. And if you don't do anything else this week, give your pets a big hug from us.